Hey, howdy, hey, my brewing brothers and sisters. It's another episode of Brew Strong. How you doing, John?
Greetings, Cretans. Doing well. Doing real well, Jamil. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. You know, there's a pandemic going on. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, we are confined to home for quite some time. I mean, you've been camping out there on a cot in your brewery for months, right?
Yeah, come up on 6 months, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
My hair grew really long. I had to figure out how to cut my own hair. I literally did have to figure out how to cut my own hair. It was
All
driving me
right.
nuts. Yeah, when everything was shut down. And you, how about you're in your compound there? You've got your forge, and you've been hammering on a lot of metal during the pandemic.
Yeah, I've been forging some knives, doing some Damascus steel, and but as in so often, when we're us creative types doing something, we're more about, like in brewing, we're more about the mash and the recipe design.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of, get that done, we keg the beer and then we kind of ignore it. Well, for
Right.
me in making knives, I'll forge out the blade and then I'll never get around to putting a handle on it.
Yeah.
So this time I worked very hard in actually making a nice handle for this knife.
Oh, sweet.
It's called a kukri,
Uh-huh.
and that took quite a bit of time, but it was very, very nice to get done. And even though I put it on backwards the first time, I had to dissolve the epoxy with acetone and then remount it and do it all right. But now it's done. I've done it. So
Boy, it must take quite a while to dissolve epoxy with acetone.
took about a week. Yeah.
It's
And
epoxy. Once that hardens, that's some pretty tough stuff.
yeah, but I was able to get it all apart, all the pieces, you know, didn't break, they didn't get brittle. I was able to put it all back together after I turned it around.
Huh?
It was
Huh.
much better.
Right. Now, I've always thought about putting like a rusted metal heretic face sign out on the building.
Yeah.
And what I would need for that is a, medieval looking wrought iron type of metal structure to hang that off of the building. Is that something you could knock out in your forge? Let's say in an
Oh
afternoon.
yeah. Yeah. A couple of afternoons perhaps,
Couple
but
of
yeah,
afternoons. Yeah.
mild steel and wrought iron,
Right.
they form a patina on them, which gives them better longevity from rust and weathering than what you'd think.
Hmm.
And so it would last pretty good length of time.
Right.
And
Well,
you're away from the coast, so
yeah, I imagine I won't live to see the end of it. Some hammer marks on there, making it look like it was created, hundreds of years ago. I think that'd be
that'd
really
be
cool.
fun. That'd be
Yeah,
fun to do.
yeah. You know what else is fun? Hanging out with our good friend John Blickman.
Oh yeah, I bet he's been cooped up back there in Indiana for a while.
Yeah, I'm surprised he hasn't gotten on the news for blowing something up or
Yeah, yeah.
creating a rocket ship to get to another planet or something.
No
He's
doubt he's innovating new products
yes,
and
on
building them in
Mars.
his, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's probably using this time to create all sorts of cool stuff. I'm sure he's probably jonesing for the time to get out to the conference and see everybody and have a good time.
That's
He
right.
is a wonderful guy and a creative guy, and he's the guy who's been paying for this show for 15 years now,
Yeah,
whatever. I don't
quite a
know.
while.
It's
Yeah,
been it's been a
since
while.
Oakland.
Yeah, and so it's really great of him, and I think one of the things we can do as you know people who appreciate this show, tell him thank you for sponsoring the show. Send him an email, feedback@blickmanengineering.com, and tell him how much you appreciate that he's paid for the show, so you get it for free. So make sure to check that out. Today we want to talk about sweetness and dryness. Matt from Virginia, he wrote in, and I apologize. He wrote in 2012,
Okay. So,
just a little while ago, and I thought it was such a great idea for a show. I set that in a special folder, which
In case of
for all
emergency, break glass.
right for all those great show ideas that I wanted to get to, and then I
Mm-hmm.
promptly forgot that I had created this folder and put these ideas in there, and
Oh,
so I emailed Matt back and said, "Hey, great question. We'll do a show about it on Tuesday." And it's like, yeah, it only took 8 years for me to respond. I'm sorry about that, Matt. And Matt said, I'd love to hear a show on beer sweetness and dryness. In wine, it's easy to talk about residual sugar because there's no complex sugars. But in brewing, there are so many sugars out there. I don't understand what is left in a fully fermented beer. Is it all starch? Is some of it unfermentable sugar that the human tongue perceives as sweet? Are we being tricked into thinking a beer is sweet because it smells like sweet things, candy, honey, fruit, etc.? This is heavy on my mind because my wife and I like our homebrew on the sweeter side. I use the London ESB strain in most of my beers, partly for the lower attenuation, but I also love the extreme esters. I was ecstatic when I found out about, via Can You Brew It that my favorite brewery, we used to do a show called Can You Brew It, and Cologne commercial beers. And that was probably back in 2012.
2012.
I don't
Yeah.
know. That my favorite brewery, Lagunitas, uses the same strain in all their beers. If you were to submit a Lagunitas recipe to a homebrew forum website, you would get blasted for just about everything from mash temps, too much crystal malt, English ale yeast, and final gravity. Yet I don't feel any of Lagunitas' beers fall on the cloying side. You've repeated a couple of times the story of drinking 2 of Tasty's beers, and one with the lower final gravity tasted sweeter to you. That needs some explaining on a scientific level. And how about the fact that many Trappist beers are loaded with crystal malts, have barely any bittering, and yet nobody whines about them being cloyingly sweet? This would be a fun social experiment. Post identical recipes on an online forum in the Belgian Double and Imperial American Amber sections, and watch people praise one and blast the other for their sweetness levels. All right, Matt. I think that's
Interesting.
actually, we rarely read a long, detailed question, but he brings up, many excellent points, which made it very easy for me to write the outline for the show. So,
Yeah.
greatly
Good.
appreciated, Matt.
Good
Job there.
question. Yeah.
Yeah. Fermentability and sweetness. What we always like to do is start with, what is sweetness? What's the I think for sweetness and many things, there's the perception versus the actual,
Right.
and like Matt is saying, I had a couple of beers. Tasty had brought. I think we were doing the Jamil show, and we were doing Belgian triple, Belgian golden, something like that.
I
Tasty
think
came,
that. Yeah.
brought in a couple of beers, and the 2 beers I had side by side, and one was clearly sweeter than the other. Yet that was the one that finished, I don't know how many points lower in gravity. Tasty was, he's like, well, I brewed this one to be drier, but it's sweeter. And, I imagine, like Matt is suggesting, you can have a beer that has a lot of fruity or candy-like characteristics to it that might trigger a memory or a thought, or sometimes somebody smells something slightly floral, they think, oh, soap, it's soapy. It's like, well, soapy is different than the floral fragrance you often find in soaps. The same thing for sweetness, fruitiness, right? John, have you ever experienced that,
Oh yeah.
dichotomy of, something sweeter but should be drier?
Yeah. And I think you have to think about, what is where does sweetness on your tongue? It's
Mm,
a particular set of receptors, and ethanol, alcohol, tastes sweet to the palate.
mhm,
And so, just looking at, Tasty's beers as an example, with a higher alcohol concentration in the lower gravity beer, maybe the same bittering level between the 2 beers, the one with the slightly higher alcohol may end up tasting sweeter because of that higher alcohol content. That's
Right.
one possibility.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the and then there's other compounds that can also taste sweet. There's protein compounds that can have a sweet taste. And, familiar with many of the artificial sweeteners on the market. Um, don't know how relevant those are to beer, but that was. Um, but some of the dextrins are typically not sweet tasting, but then they have flavors associated them with well that may be interpreted by your palate as being sweet.
Hmm.
So I think there's a lot of room for uh, perceiving enhanced sweetness, even with less sugar or lower
Right.
gravity.
Right. Yeah, and even a fullness, a beer that has
Yeah,
a bigger mouthfeel. Oftentimes, people will say, "Oh, that's sweeter," and that isn't necessarily the case. Sweetness. It's very very difficult in beer judging and just beer appreciation to be able to clearly say, "Oh, this is sweeter." I'm separating that out from, for example, the hop bitterness.
hmm,
I think especially in Belgian ales, they will lean on the alcohol sweetness and alcohol bitterness balance, and the kind of drying effect also.
hmm, yeah,
As you exhale on a Belgian and being fully attenuated, then most of the Belgians are very fully attenuated. And using that example of a Belgian double versus, an American IPA, um, the thing about American IPA is you don't tend to use a yeast that attenuates quite as much as a Belgian strain. So
right,
that's part of the difference. But the Belgian strain, it depends on the alcohols created. One of the things that Matt was asking was, what's left over at the end of fermentation? Well, you have a bunch of uh, longer chain sugars. You'll have maltose. You can have glucose left over. Generally, glucose is one of those things that yeast take up so easily that there is none left. It depends on a lot of factors. If you are
right.
brewing in a certain way where you're throwing in a lot of simple sugars, during fermentation, you may end up with that glucose as you kind of overwhelm the yeast, and eventually, the alcohol level has stopped them. Then you can end up with some unfermented glucose left over. And there's starches, of course. Starches are, a polysaccharide. They're long chains of sugar joined together, and so you've got these sugars, but there's these long chains of sugars, and they don't taste sweet once they're arranged in this manner. They have some of them have some sweetness. For example, some of the dextrins, the maltose has some sweetness to it, but um, some of them become these starches are not sweet at all.
Right,
Proteins, of course, those are left over as well, and that's going to be made up of one or more linear chains of amino acids. And so you got your starches, you got your proteins, you got alcohols, of course, and that's a big flavor component. And
right.
then you've got, and that, as you're saying, can be sweet, it can be bitter, it can have a lot of different aromatics to it. And the yeast derived what we call flavor active compounds. So, um, ethanol, of course, uh, carbon dioxide,
Yeah,
carbonyls, aldehydes, ketones,
right.
the higher alcohols, the fusel alcohols. I rant about that all the time. Esters, esters, of course, we're all familiar with at least the
Right,
concept of esters. VDKs, your diacetyl and other compounds.
right.
There's fatty and organic acids that are left in there, and sulfur compounds. So you
Right.
always have all of those compounds in a beer. All those yeast derived. I mean, there's like 800 different compounds that are end up in beer from fermentation, and that's where a majority of your perception of sweetness is actually going to come from.
Yeah.
uh, you know, the alcohol and all these other yeast active flavor compounds.
Well, you bring up the esters, and I think those are a very important component in perceived sweetness because, uh, these esters are very fruity smelling. Um, they depend on, the amount of them in the beer and your a particular individual's association with those ester aromas that will, those aromas may trigger the perception of sweetness in their palate
Hmm.
because so much of flavor is aroma,
Right.
and there's that
Absolutely.
synergy between them. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think ester-derived sweetness perception is a factor, a big factor.
Oh, definitely. And have you ever smelled something and you say, "Oh, that smells sweet." It's got a sweetness to it.
Right,
Without tasting something, you can identify something as being sweet or savory or bitter or harsh or something like that. There's just so many descriptors that you might put on something, and sweet is one of them.
yeah,
Sometimes it is you look at a cinnamon roll and you smell the cinnamon, and
yeah,
there's other compounds in there that perhaps come from the frosting or whatever that
yep,
give you that.
caramels, yeah,
You're thinking, "Oh, that's sweet." The and so you've seen it with your eyes, you smelled it, and then you're anticipating sweet as you bite into it. The same thing can happen
right,
with a beer where you're anticipating, oh, this style of beer is sweet. Oh, look at the color. Oh, look at, it's, or I brewed it this way, so it's
hmm,
gonna be sweet. And so you do have that perception. One of the things about the thing with Tasty, when I tasted those two beers, I really didn't know which one finished drier. I didn't know. I
right,
didn't know anything about the beers really, before I tasted them. And so I'm pretty certain that I was correct in my assessment that one was sweeter than the other. I didn't have like any preconceived notion
right,
as to which one
right,
would be sweeter. So I think that's you know there's a true, we need to let go of the old uh wisdom where, oh, the beer finishes higher, it's a sweeter beer. I think that was back in the day when a lot of fermentations were
right,
incomplete, right?
yeah,
And so you were leaving behind a lot of maltose. You were leaving behind perhaps some simpler sugars because people were not using adequate yeast. They weren't using healthy yeast. They were using, packets of dry yeast that sat on top of, malt extract cans for a year in a warm in a store. And then, or they were using, some bread yeast or something.
right,
And, they ended up with a sweeter beer. And so, and that, I'm sure that still happens to this day. People are getting incomplete fermentations,
yeah,
but you have to let go of the idea that a higher finishing gravity means a sweeter beer. It means a lot of different things, but not necessarily a sweeter beer.
right. Yeah, I mean, there's so many times judging in competitions, you'll pick up a beer and smell it, it's the first thing you do when judging. And sometimes you can smell the sweetness, and but then science tells us, oh, you really can't smell sweet.
Hmm.
Well, what you can smell are the caramel compounds and other compounds that we associate with sweetness. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
there, ergo it smells sweet. We then perceive it as tasting sweet.
Hmm.
And then as we finish the beer, as we swallow and we experience the finish of the beer, maybe that finish is dry, or maybe it finishes less dry, and that's where more of the actual sweetness comes into play.
Right.
But yeah, tasting perception is a very complicated
Well, and
subject.
yeah, you can smell, things that are sour. I mean, you can just
Yeah,
tell something sour from, whatever the organoleptic, thing is that, in your mind,
mm,
is sour compounds.
yeah,
And it's, you don't have to taste your socks to know they're funky.
Right, right. So, but yeah, going back to our, our beers, our mash, we can adjust the residual sugars in a
Mm-hmm.
beer with
Mm-hmm.
our mash temps. We
Right.
can promote the either high fermentability or low fermentability. I did an experiment with that for a homebrew con. Oh gosh, back in maybe it was 2005.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of guys, when we were in Denver, I think we brewed, same recipe, high mash temperature, low mash temperature, and it made a difference of a couple points in final gravity, and difference in the profile of the beer as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, so talking about what makes one beer sweeter than another, mash temperatures. Did you really, find one sweeter than the other, or they just different? One was maybe fuller. Um,
Yeah, yeah, but
uh,
both of the beers were very well balanced. I don't remember there being, you didn't taste one and say, "Oh, this is sweet."
mm-hmm,
It wasn't a Three Bears situation.
right.
Um, but, there was a difference in final gravity between the two, and the perception of the beer was one that was a little, a bit sweeter than the other,
Mm-hmm,
a bit fuller tasting. One of them was a bit drier. But,
right.
we're talking about small differences there in terms of the balance of the beer was good. It
Right.
was just nuances of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think when people say, "Oh, mash higher for a sweeter beer," yes and no. There's such a slight sweetness to some of the longer chain sugars. Longer than
Right,
maltose. Maltose itself does have a sweetness to it. It's less sweet than sucrose, but it's also generally flavorless. Doesn't really have a whole lot of flavor to it. um,
right,
so it may add to that perception. And I think the experiment on a low gravity beer, something where you're trying to hit with 3% ABV versus something where you're trying to hit a 12 or 14% ABV.
right,
You may end up with more leftover short chain sugars on something bigger than you would on something smaller. And I think that makes a difference too. Like we're saying, the mash temp can make, lend itself to a perception of fullness. And, eh, a lot of times people say mash temperature does not create body, but
yeah,
it really, really lends itself to that perception of fullness in my experience.
right, right,
So I consider that part of body. And so I think mash temperature is really most importantly kind of that body, a little bit of residual sweetness. I mean, it takes quite a bit of, points of leftover maltose to add to that. And again,
right,
if you're using a yeast that attenuates well and you're in the, 6% range, 5-6% range, you're not going to notice a huge difference because most of that maltose was taken up. If you're just leaving a tiny bit of extra maltose left over, it's going to add a little bit of sweetness, but not much. When it gets to those longer, raffinose and things like that,
right.
there's
Hmm.
almost no sweetness to it at all. So that's where we're talking about the polysaccharides when they become much longer chain. Um, it's the sweetness decreases. So mash temps generally are not controlling sweetness. We gotta kind of let go of that. I think
Hmm.
tiny bit.
But yeah, but fullness and body,
Hmm.
perception of viscosity can have some effect as well.
Right, and like we were talking earlier, that perception of body, that fullness, is going to add to your idea that the beer is sweeter as well.
Right,
Right.
right,
Yeast strains. Now that's a big part of what creates a sweeter beer or a drier beer.
right,
Um, one of the big things is there are hoppy strains and malty strains. And people wonder, they're like, well, why does this, increase the perception of hops or malt? It depends on, some of the compounds that the yeast produce. It depends on, how aggressively they attenuate different sugars. Um, that has a major impact on sweetness.
Right.
A malty English strain versus a really dry, American strain or Belgian strain is going to, really change, um, those yeast derived flavor active compounds that we're talking about. And so you're going to get more esters or fusel alcohols or, some of those things that lend itself to the sweetness.
Hmm. Yeah,
Let's see. Yeah.
different strains, such as even your lager strains, tend to ferment maltotriose
Hmm.
better than ale strains. So that's why we often perceive lagers, excuse me, often perceive lagers as being drier
Drier.
beers than
Mhm.
ales.
Right. Right. And maltotriose, I believe, isn't very sweet at all. But
No.
the fact that the lager strain will go through the majority of the maltose
Hmm.
before it gets to maltotriose and raffinose, and um, that in itself, I think, is what's making it a drier, crisper. A friend of mine, Travis, was asking, why, are lagers crisper than an ale? Why can't you make a crisp ale? With a you can make a crisp ale, but if you made the same beer with the lager yeast, does it turn out crisper? And I think one of the reasons is the lager yeast will tend to consume more of the maltose and not leave as much maltose behind as the ale strains do. So that's a good point, John. Um, yeah, different strains are going to produce the different flavor profiles.
Yep.
The higher alcohols, 2-phenylethanol is,
Oh, yeah.
roses, sweetness, a perfume.
Hmm.
And again, people kind of will associate that sometimes with, a sweeter, richer character. Esters, ethyl acetate, that's also got a sweetness to it. That's also, considered solventy or fruity.
Right.
One of those things that you get, in higher fermentations as well. 2-phenyl ethyl acetate, roses, honey, apples, also sweet. They kind of
Yeah.
got a sweet character to it.
I
And
often tend to
Mhm.
confuse that one with acetaldehyde, because there is that that apple note or that
That raw
uh,
apple.
yeah. So and then again, then sometimes you can get the honey aroma as well
Hmm.
from that, and I tend to associate that with VDKs. So
Right.
there's different compounds that will create different perception in people's
Hmm.
minds.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of times it's very difficult for people to isolate. I had somebody that worked for me, and he was like, "Oh, this beer is full of diacetyl." Yeah, we brew a lager here, and we've got a lab, and we will test it, but we also like to, just do it by taste, and just taste the beer and see, and then we check it in the lab, and we're like, okay, we were right or wrong, VDK levels, and we're okay or good to package. And he would say, "Oh my God, there's a ton of diacetyl in this. This is unbelievably high." And then I'd taste it. I'm like, we were tasting separately. I'd say, "Yeah, it's good to go. We're ready to package. There's no
Yeah,
perceivable diacetyl in here." And so we'd run it through the lab, and then it'd be below like 9. It was so low that there's no way. So I'm
yeah,
not sure what compounds were triggering this perception of diacetyl for this guy. But there was something he was sensing that he thought was diacetyl that wasn't.
right.
So, and I see it in competitions as well in judging. I'll be judging with somebody and they'll go, "Oh, ton of diacetyl." I'm like, I- I'm the weird thing is I'm okay with diacetyl as a compound in beer.
A little
I,
bit, yeah,
I,
yeah.
I like a little bit in a little bit more in British ales. I'm actually, kind of a fan of getting a little bit. And in all ales, it adds again to the fullness perception. It can add a bit of sweetness or butterscotch compound to a beer, or at least the perception of that. And so it's not completely this horrible, evil thing that needs to be eradicated at all
Right.
costs, which has driven us to, a lot of the West Coast ale cleanness and crispness, which is great. But I'm just saying, there's other styles of beer out there, and a little bit
Yeah.
of diacyl's fine. Anyways, yeah. So, by being able to check in the lab and, taste and check and taste and check, able to, when we had a point where the lab wasn't available, we weren't able to do, what problem did we have that we weren't able to run VDKs? Anyways, so you can taste and be certain if you know exactly what diacetyl tastes like in beer.
Right.
The vinyl diketones, you can be certain of what you're doing, and I think that's a skill that homebrewers need to evolve, because homebrewers often don't have access to the equipment to run VDK samples. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Being able to take a sensory course where you can, smell, sample the standards, for diacetyl, for acetaldehyde, for other compounds, is very, very instructive. I mean, to be able to isolate that compound and see what it smells like to you, and helps you identify it better in competitions.
I remember the first time you and I met. Do you remember when that was?
I think it would have been the MCAB 2000.
It was the MCAB, the
Yeah.
Masters Championship of Amateur Brewing. Is that what MCAB
Yeah.
stands for?
Yeah.
Yeah. Back it was in Berkeley.
Yep.
And what year might that have been?
2000 or 2001.
Right.
I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe 2002, but yeah, it might have been earlier than that. And you and I sat next to each other during a sensory thing where they were sending around pictures of like
Oh yeah,
Budweiser, Bud Light with, dosed with various things. And we were going through it, and I remember, going like, "Oh, yeah, John knows his stuff. This is pretty exciting." I'm sitting next to John Palmer.
And meanwhile, I'm thinking, I'm sitting next to Jamil. This guy's smart.
Yeah, and then boy, I still remember that to this day. That's where I got that story about brewing takes Germans and stainless steel and all that. That was the Fritz Maytag thing. He also
Oh yeah,
told a story about perception of something, or the story
That's
behind
right.
something can change your perception. I keep harping on that. Recently on Beer Advocate, I was answering some questions about that, and I was talking about how perception is so important or your preconceived notion is so important about what your perception is. And
yeah,
I get a little bit of time. I'll tell the Fritz Maytag story. So
yeah, he was there. George Fix was there.
George Fix was there. I met George Fix for the first time. It's a great hero of mine.
Yeah.
The Fritz Maytag story. He was telling a story. He said, if you let's say I'm invited to dinner to your house, and it's up in the foothills, and I go up there, and with dinner you bring out 2 bottles of wine, and you say, "Hey, this one right here, it has received a very high score on whatever the wine point scoring thing is. It's 98 points, and this one here, it hasn't been scored. It's something I made myself. We grew the grapes here. My grandfather, he planted the grapes on this property, and when he came to America, 100 years ago,
Right.
and so we picked the grapes, and I used his old recipe for fermenting and all this, and his old big the same wine barrels that he used, and that's the wine that I made. And Fritz is like, I would go with the wine with the story every time, and that one's going to taste better to me because It's got, he told a beautiful
Yeah.
story, and I'm
Right. I
backing it
remember
up
that.
here.
Yeah.
But, it's always going to, taste better. It's always going to be more interesting to me. And it's the one I'm going to want to have because, there's a rich background to it. It's not just, here's
Right.
something I bought, or, story makes will change your perceptions. If Tasty told me, I've got another story. Yeah, I got time. You guys all stay and listen. Dave Sapsis.
Yes.
So Dave Sapsis is my sensei. He
Yep.
taught me a lot about judging beer. And
Me too.
when I was starting out, we used to drive up, or I drove and he rode along, up to the Washoe Zephyr Zymergis up in Reno. Good friends up there, John Tull and Ron, a whole bunch of wonderful people up there. They taught me a lot about judging and just being a wonderful homebrew club. They used to have their competition once a year, and we'd drive up there, Dave and I, and we'd judge, and I'd also enter the competition. Well, one year he was judging German lagers, and also judged the best of show. And he, a bunch of the rest of us, since I entered, I couldn't be in best of show because apparently one of my beers was in there, or a few. And during that judging, all the rest of us were standing around kind of listening in on the best of show judging. And I remember there was a North German Pilsner in there that Dave had, given first place to and really loved, but and everyone else was crazy about it. I'm thinking, that's going to be the best of show beer. I didn't know it was my beer at the time, but then, Dave's comments on it, he goes, yeah, but I think it's just still, just a touch too sweet to be best of show. And so they gave the best of show to something else. Well, lo and behold, shortly after that, I find out that was my North German Pils in there.
Nice.
And, it didn't get best of show. On the drive back, I think Dave and I were talking about it, and I'm like, he's like, yeah, it's just a little too sweet. I said, I thought I was spot on. He thought it needed be a little drier, and I always, I respect him and all the other judges, so I'm like, okay, it needs to be a little drier. So fast forward a year, and I brew the beer again. I lower the mash temp, and I get the thing to finish out a few points lower. I taste it. I'm like, spot on. I made it drier. And enter in the same competition. Dave and I drive up there again. Lo and behold, he ends up judging German lagers because he loves German lagers. And I think it gets like second place or third place. And I'm like, well, what happened? It wasn't perfect. There's two other beers better than that. And so afterwards, I found out afterwards that I got that. And so on the drive back, because he would hand out your sheets and announce the awards right there at the end of the competition, which was nice. On the drive back, I tell Dave, I'm like, well, that was my North German Pils in there that got like second place. And I said, I made it drier than, last year. And he goes, that was your beer? He says, oh, okay. He goes, I thought that it was sweeter than the one from the previous year, from the year before in Best of Show. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, the old man's losing his mind. He doesn't know what what's what. This one was drier. I lowered my mash temperature, and it attenuated out further, so it's got to be drier, right? And so he's like, well, I could be wrong. It was a year ago, and maybe I'm mistaken. He's very gracious about it.
Right.
You can tell, you don't cross somebody who's, talking about their competition scores or whatever.
That's right.
And so I go home, and I've happened to save bottles of that German Pilsner from the previous year.
Oh,
I've got the two for side by side. They've been refrigerated the whole time. Sure, it's a year, but good refrigeration will really preserve a beer.
Yeah.
So I have my wife pour me a blind triangle test. And in the blind triangle test, one of the beers is clearly sweeter. It's a small difference,
Mm-hmm.
but clearly, I was able to pick it out, from the triangle test.
Yeah.
And it turns out that that was the newest beer, the current beer.
Oh.
So I brewed it at a lower mash temperature. It attenuated more, but it was sweeter. So thus, I learned a couple of things. One is about beer memory, and that Dave is rarely wrong on his beer memory. A year apart, he could tell the difference between those two beers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that taught me that I needed to improve my beer memory. And so one of the things I try and do now is kind of lock in beer experiences in my mind. What exactly were the perceptions that I had about a different beer? It's why I can't remember people's names,
Right. There's
because
other important stuff.
I'm
Yeah.
filling my mind with, these notes about, various beers, so that when I have them again, I can compare and contrast. So it taught me that, and also taught me about mash temperature really isn't the thing that makes this big difference in, sweetness of beer. It's all
Perceiving
these
it.
other things about beer. It's, how much you pitch. It's, what strain you use. Although I use the same strain, I probably pitch the same amount of yeast. But, it's slight temperature differences. It's, slight little things that all add up to, a slightly different beer. So, uh,
Mm-hmm. And of course, then there's the hopping of the two.
right. It could be that the hops that I used were different crop of hops. The malt that I use, a different crop of malt.
Right.
When you're apart, how they're grown, all that makes a big difference. And I did not have I was fairly new then still, and I didn't have the knowledge about all these different things that I do now. And so that really, can make a significant difference. So that wild rambling and aside, uh, I found it quite fun to reminisce with you about the first time we met. I can
That
still
was.
see you sitting to the right of me, and the notes. And I was like, I think I got one wrong, and you got it right. And I'm like, oh man, that John, man, he knows his stuff. Uh,
I was working hard. That was a great
or
competition.
or you just guessed. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that might have been it too, knowing me.
You
Yeah.
got lucky. All right, so let's talk a little bit about residual sugar, because residual sugar can have, an enormous impact
Right.
on, the sweetness of beer. And like we were talking before, this is where it comes in, where the old uh, mindset of um, a higher finishing gravity will give
Right.
you, uh,
More
greater
sweetness. Yeah.
greater sweetness, right? But the thing is, again, if you attenuate more, and you still leave behind a lot of glucose, you're going to end up with a sweeter beer. So it just depends on, because glucose is quite sweet.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
the residual sugar is mainly fermentation related. Your specific gravity, your starting specific gravity, the yeast, and the limits. The yeast strain, like we're talking about, and your yeast limits.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to push a beer beyond 15%, you're going to
Right.
end up with some residual sugars. We did a beer 16.5% hazy IPA called Amnesia Juice, and we did that with Cal Ale yeast, or our hazy strain, or both. And Cal Ale yeast, they'll tell you it's like, 14%, maybe 15%. And I've done some 15% beers with it before, so I just kind of wanted to see how much further it would go, and so we got to 16.5 pretty easy, but it started crapping out and leaving behind glucose, or I guess the right hand form of glucose. We were using
Right.
dextrose in it, which is, for all those reading along,
Corn sugar.
dextrose is really it's glucose. It's the right hand version of glucose. The left hand version of glucose doesn't ferment. The right hand version does.
Yeah. Dextrose, corn sugar, glucose,
Mhm.
synonymous.
All the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. Uh,
Well, pitching rate, I
adjuncts.
mean, oh, okay.
Oh, pitching rate. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to affect your fermentation.
Hmm.
It's going to affect, the total yeast mass, the rate of fermentation. It's pitching rate, I think, is definitely another factor to keep in mind
Right.
when, looking at what the perception of sweetness from a beer is going to be.
Mhm.
Because,
Well, and yeah, fermentation temperature, oxygen,
yeah,
nutrients, all that stuff is going to kind of play around with, again, all those yeast derived flavor active compounds that we're talking about.
right, right,
What you get out of fermentation is determined by the setup for fermentation. It's like, think about it like I don't know, golf shot or archery or whatever. It's the
hmm,
setup that determines where the arrow is going to go. For example, it's the bow, it's your stance, it's your draw, it's the angle, it's all that stuff. Yeah, there's some windage that comes into play, but you're trying to adjust for the windage. But
yeah,
it's that moment that you're getting ready to launch fermentation that determines where the arrow is going to land. And so and where your fermentation is going to finish. You have some adjustment along the way, maybe with temperature or something like that, or additional oxygen additions. But generally, it's the setup that determines how that's going to go and how sweet your finish is going to be.
yeah. Dr. Michael Lewis had a really good talk a number of years ago where he basically said if you're trying to brew the same beer, you need to have the same fermentation, you
Right.
know,
Right.
and
Exactly.
you change one thing, different fermentation, different beer.
Hmm. Yeah, I harp on that here at Heretic. It's why I want pH readings every day, gravity readings every day, because that tells you that everything's tracking the same. Those are two easy things to monitor every day. That there you go. If it's doing the same thing, this fermentation as it did, the last 100 fermentations, we're good. It's going to be
Yeah,
the same
yeah,
beer. And then adjuncts. Like I was saying, when we're adding, trying to drive 001 past up to its highest level,
right.
we added dextrose, and eventually you add so much that and it's not able to finish. You've got that left over in the beer.
Hmm.
Unfermentable sugars, like we talked about, the mash, all that.
Right.
That's going to give you some residual sugars, even if it's all maltose. If all the maltose doesn't get attenuated, maltose, it's like what, 2/3 of Swedish sugar or something like that.
Right. Right.
And then that's going to have an effect, and the timing of those additions can make a difference. And malt related, like Matt was talking about recipes heavy in crystal malt.
Right.
Um, Crystal malts do add in a bunch of unfermentable sugar, and
Right.
it is sweet. Um, some of the sugars in crystal malt are fermentable. Any brewing software that tells you it's 100% unfermentable is incorrect. The same thing on some of the dark malts. Like that's how they make Sinmar. They actually ferment it. They get a tiny bit of fermentation out of it.
Yeah.
And that way, it's still right Heizgebot to add Sinmar to your beer. Any crystal malts, unfermentable sugars, lactose.
Oh
Lactose
yeah.
actually
Hmm.
got a bit of sweetness to it. I think it's sweet. It's got to be sweeter than maltodextrin.
Right.
Um,
Maltodextrin's tasteless.
yeah,
But yeah.
tasteless and not sweet at all. And um, supposedly, what do people use it for? Adding body to a beer, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Body. But
I think there's easier ways of doing that, and that's
mhm.
mash temperature. I guess if you're working with extract only or something like that. And any other unfermentable sugars you might add will of course affect your fermentation or your perception of sweetness, right?
Right.
Any other thoughts about uh, sweetness and dryness?
Yeah. I think we've covered the main points. I mean, mash temperatures, ingredients, adjuncts, fermentation, all of those things, really play a role in the production of the aromas of the beer,
Mm-hmm.
And then thereby the perception of flavors of the beer. Um, Certainly, different yeast strains ferment, even among ale strains, big differences in the fermentability, the types of sugars they consume, and the degree to which they'll consume them. As you say, there can be leftover maltose in the beer. There's going to be leftover maltotriose, which is a 3-sugar saccharide. Then you have maltotetriose, which is a 4-sugar saccharide that's generally not fermented,
Mm-hmm.
but
and
it's
and not really sweet.
right, not really sweet. But again, it adds to that body, and it
Mm-hmm.
has
The
a
perception.
flavor that you would associate with sweet beers. Different yeast strains will ferment those sugars differently, and that will also affect the perception of sweetness of the beer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, going back to the original post here, when you have the same beers side by side, or same recipe side by side, um, you know, same yeast strain. Um, Now we're looking a little deeper, but yeah,
Well, and I'd say, when you're trying to analyze what the result is of whatever change you made, try and do it blind. Have somebody pour you a blind
yes,
triangle test and see. And because if you get in your mind that something, like I was saying, I had in my mind that the beer I brewed was drier because I took those steps.
that's
If
right,
I had maybe taken a moment to think about it, and try it side by side with the other beer, I would have realized that it wasn't. My preconceived notions that what I had done had made a drier beer is what got me into trouble there.
right,
And I think it's the same thing about maybe the Lagunitas beers. People hear that they use mash temperatures in the 160s, and they're like, "Oh no, that's really sweet." It tends to be really full but not really sweet, so they also attenuating well, so it's a balancing act. They use a lot of hops, they use a lot of bittering.
right,
That tends to balance it as well. And then also it's the kind of alcohols, I can't stress enough, it's the kind of alcohols, esters, and other compounds you get through fermentation that make the difference. And that's where sweetness is really developed, right there.
right,
All right.
right.
An excellent show. Thank you very much, Matt from Virginia, on sparking this idea. Sorry it took me over 8 years to get to it, but this is proof. If nothing, I am
We will get to them.
I am thorough, and we'll eventually get to every question. Like I said, we'll plow through that thing. And if you have questions for Brew Strong, you send it to brewstrong at thebrewingnetwork.com. And we actually do get all those emails. You get like a form thing back saying we can't answer all these emails with email, but we get them on the show, and we make sure that we're covering all those questions because we know how important it is to all of you.
Yep.
And I want to tell you how important our good friend John Blickman at blickmanengineering.com is to us, that he pays for the show. So Justin allows us to, keep meeting like this,
Right.
having fun. So make sure, send him a nice email at feedback@blickmanengineering.com. And if you get a chance, check out the cool stuff that they got on their website. They're always innovating, creating new and useful and unique pieces of brewing gear, anything from homebrew to professional. If you want to set up a even a production brewery, they're producing equipment of that size now. So
Oh yeah.
check it out, give them a shot. Good people, and that's all you need to know. So thanks then, and until then, brew strong.
Brew strong, everyone.